2024. Note: all of that information in the long conclusion will be able to help you permanently reduce some suffering in many different aspects of your life. However, if you want to permanently eliminate all suffering in your life, then you have to open your mind to the fact that the solution to this is not in life existence, but from life existence. Note: no matter where you are, no matter where you start from, this solution conclusion is always the same. Before moving into the summary, let's run through this solution conclusion in a slightly different way as follows. To get to the key point, let's start from here. People are obviously not free because they're not provided with an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way out of life whenever they want. And the only reason why people are not provided with an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way out of life is because everyone wants to imprison, torture, enslave, rape everyone as their personal slaves and or work slaves. And therefore, this means that life will always inherently be prison, torture, slavery, rape. And therefore, this means that life will always inherently be suffering. Indeed, a clear, honest observation of life will show you that all of the statements in this conclusion are true. And no matter which way you come at it, the result is always the same, which is that life is suffering. And if you're able to see clearly, honestly, you'll see how even the most amazing, wonderful things in life are inextricably interlinked with suffering. So, from all of the above, we can then say that, since suffering is unacceptable and unnecessary, and life is suffering, it inherently follows that life is unacceptable and unnecessary, and therefore that existence is unacceptable and unnecessary. However, the ultimate permanent solution to all problems, pain, suffering, discomfort in life and existence is the same as the ultimate permanent freedom, peace, love, bliss, which everyone is seeking, desiring. And therefore, all desires, fears, seeking, and realizations will inevitably lead to this one same thing, which is that non-existence. And therefore, it becomes clear that some of these previous statements, e.g., existence is unacceptable and unnecessary, is not a bad thing, because everyone's deepest desire is for that non-existence. Indeed, when you see things clearly, honesty, you realize that everything is actually pointing in this direction. E.g., earlier on in this conclusion, I said, the type A people society aren't trying to be moral or whatever else. They just simply don't want any person thing to suffer. Of course, I only said this as a stepping stone because the truth is that by the time society is 100% moral, it is non-existent. I.e., even if people society are 90% moral, they will still have suffering in their lives, because suffering will be caused, because there are still 10% immorality. And therefore, they will naturally be propelled to keep eliminating suffering in ever deeper ways, and at ever deeper levels, until there is zero suffering for all people, entities, beings at all levels, including existence itself. Note: from this previous statement, by the time society is truly 100% moral, it is non-existence. It is non-existent. It's obvious that by the time a society is truly worth living in, it is non-existent. And indeed, all of this is true at all levels, and therefore, when this is applied at the level of the individual person, it is realized that by the time a person entity is truly 100% moral, it is non-existent. And from this, it's obvious that by the time a person, body, consciousness is truly worth living in, having, it is non-existent. And when this is applied at the level of existence, it is realized that by the time existence is what truly 100% moral, it is non-existent, i.e. non-existence, i.e. that. And from this, it's obvious that by the time existence is truly worth living and having, it is in non existent, i.e., non existence, i.e., that. And therefore, the inescapable conclusion is that the only thing truly worth living in, having, being, is that non existence. Therefore, from all of the above, it becomes obvious that no matter where you start, it always comes down to the same conclusion, realization, solution, desire, which is that the ideal permanent solution desire of how to end all suffering for all and get that which is beyond freedom, peace, love, bliss is to end existence in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way. Boom. It might sound strange to some people to say that existence can be ended instant, painlessly, but it is a practical possibility because anything that is created can be ended. And this is true no matter whether the creation of existence is a projection, holographic, virtual, real, solid, a computer simulation, etc. That's a great point right there. Note, perhaps only certain people entities have the ability to end existence in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way. Or perhaps it needs a few people entities to be able to do this. And or perhaps this needs to be 0.1% of the population. And or perhaps certain devices, equipment are needed. However, whatever the case, the important thing to realize is that life existence can be ended, and it will definitely be ended because it is already happening. Indeed, life existence is naturally, inherently, inevitably going to end because life and existence are just systems. And no system is 100%, i.e., all systems will naturally, inherently, inevitably crack, and then they will keep cracking until they no longer exist, i.e., it's not a matter of if, but when. However, it's also important to remember that when speaking about any type of systems, e.g., political, societal, financial, interpersonal, personal, religious, spiritual, etc., it is obvious that all systems are going to inherently always cause suffering. And therefore, the longer the system continues, the longer the suffering will drag on, i.e., the longer the system continues, until the system totally ends, no longer exists, the longer the suffering will drag on. And since life existence is a system, this means that the longer existence continues until existence totally ends, no longer exists, the longer the suffering will drag on. And of course, the speed at which a system will come to an end is dependent on various factors. Indeed, a good example of this is that a building can't collapse end if people entities are constantly maintaining, perpetuating that building. I.e., in more general terms, a system can't collapse end if people entities are constantly maintaining, perpetuating that system. And at a deeper level, this means that existence can't collapse end if people entities are constantly maintaining, perpetuating that existence. And what this means is that suffering can't collapse end if people entities are constantly maintaining, perpetuating that suffering. Therefore, everyone needs to realize, recognize, admit that 1. Life and existence are just systems. 2. All systems cause suffering. 3. The only true permanent way to end all suffering for all is to instantly, painlessly end all systems. And therefore, the ultimate permanent solution to end all suffering for all is to instantly, painlessly end existence. Because then what remains is that which is beyond peace, love, bliss, pain, suffering, etc., which is what everyone is truly wanting. And the only way this will all happen quicker is if people recognize and admit all the key points in this conclusion, e.g., that Life and existence is prison, torture, slavery, rape. Life and existence is survival of the stupidest. Suffering is unacceptable and unnecessary. Using, enslaving people and personal slaves and or work slaves is unacceptable and unnecessary. Life and existence is unacceptable and unnecessary, etc. And it's important to realize that this will all just naturally happen if people just stop deluding, lying, misdirecting, brainwashing, programming, gaslighting themselves and others, i.e., just stop with all that selfishness, stupidity, immorality, because it only causes you and everyone suffering, because you and everyone are just perpetuating suffering. However, do not see the things that I'm saying in this conclusion as new beliefs to cling to. Actually, this is not an issue, because all of this information will do its job and then dissolve itself. Indeed, this is obvious, because if people's societies act on this type of information, it will naturally propel them to keep moving towards less and less suffering, and ever deeper freedom, peace, love, bliss, until it's all that remains is that. Note, a typical argument, excuse, misdirection, is that many people will say is, if all people, entities, things, dimensions, and existence itself are all inevitably leading towards that, then nothing needs to be done. The simple answer to this is that doing this is fine if you want to suffer. Indeed, it all just depends on how much people societies want to suffer. I'll explain this as follows. In terms of how much people societies want to suffer, this can be broken down into three options. Option 1. Extreme long-term suffering will happen to all people's societies which are taking the indirect, totally opposite direction route to that. What I mean by the indirect, total opposite direction route is that these people's societies are choosing a route of being selfish, immoral, bad, which will cause themselves immense long-term suffering. And this will keep happening until the suffering becomes so extreme that they are then forced to stop and examine all things in life, and life existence itself. However, if they do not examine all aspects of life and all levels of life and life existence itself in a clear, honest, ever deeper way, then they will have to suffer more, i.e., keep going through this cycle of suffering until they realize that the ultimate and only solution to suffering is the same as the ultimate freedom, peace, love, bliss, which is that, non-existence. And therefore, all their actions from that point onwards is to help them and everyone get directly to that, i.e., all their actions are then moral, whereas the way that they were before was purely about them living in a selfish, immoral, bad life, where they used, enslaved other people as personal slaves and or work slaves. Side note, just to reiterate this point, yes, I did use the word bad because there is good, bad, and right, wrong, moral, immoral, etc. This is obvious, and I'll explain this in more detail when I explain the neutral, natural, true start point for everything in the summary. Option 2, short-term suffering, will happen to all people societies which are taking the direct route to that. These people societies are just naturally moral. They just naturally do not want to cause suffering to others, and therefore, A, they just naturally do not want to bring any babies, entities into existence. B, they just naturally want to provide all people's entities with the freedom choice option to leave life existence in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way. C, they just naturally want to help deprogram any person, entity who wants to truly fully deprogram themselves. And obviously, these people societies no longer brainwash program anyone. Note, it's important to see that deprogramming will naturally happen without external help. As soon as the constant brainwashing programming, which everyone is constantly doing to each other, stops. Indeed, this is inevitable because when someone suffers, they naturally stop to investigate what caused their suffering. This is what happened to me personally. This is what led to my awakening, awareness, whatever you want to call it. However, in selfish immoral societies, they get constantly told, brainwashed, programmed to believe that suffering, which they are directly experiencing, is acceptable, important, necessary, etc., and therefore, this causes them to repeat the cycle of suffering. An analogy of this is that you burn your hand on a hot stove, and therefore you then remove it. However, you then get brainwashed, programmed to believe that suffering, which you just experienced, is something that you must just accept. Because that's just part of life. You must be strong. You must persevere and succeed. Pull yourself up on your bootstraps. Of course, if you accept this, then you're going to put your hand back on the hot stove, and so the cycle of suffering continues. Option 3. Zero suffering. Zero suffering will happen to all people societies which are taking the instant route to that. These people societies know that option 1 is pure stupidity, because why would you want to cause suffering to yourself? And they also know that option 2 is good, but it's still a little bit stupid, because if you know that the ultimate end result solution desire is that, then why not just go straight to that? And therefore, these people societies will try to end existence in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way. There is also a fourth option, which is those people societies who are doing option 2 and 3 simultaneously. I.e., whilst trying to do option 3, they're also doing option 2. Note, it's important to realize that even if people believe that option 3 is too difficult, or impossible, or whatever else, there is absolutely no excuse for not doing option 2, because points A, B, and C, mentioned in option 2 above, are all able to be done by all people societies, because A, B, and C do not need some skills or technology, which only exist in the future, i.e., it's all able to be done right now. And therefore, there is obviously no excuse for any people societies to justify their immoral behavior. Note, some people may say that after existence ends, it will just restart again, i.e., it won't be permanent. This argument can be countered, and I will explain this all in more detail in the long conclusion. Indeed, all arguments are countered. However, what is more important to see is that all such arguments are not only countered, but are actually totally irrelevant. This might sound strange, but it's true. I'll explain why in the long conclusion. The key point is that no matter what arguments are used or what aspect of life you're examining, and I will examine all aspects of everyday life, the ultimate solution desire is always the same, which is zero suffering for all, and that for all, by ending existence in an instant, painless, effortless, guaranteed, permanent way. Note, it's important to see that I could have written all of this without any mention of that, and without any discussion about ending the whole of existence. Indeed, I could have just said that the conclusion of this book is that everyone has one choice to make. This choice will determine everything in your life, including how much you will suffer, and how much freedom, peace, love, bliss there will be in your life. This choice has to be made is between option A, you choose to believe that suffering is acceptable. Option B, you choose to believe that suffering is unacceptable. It really is that simple. Nothing more needs to be said. The reason why nothing more needs to be said is because after this choice is made, everything will naturally follow. Of course, if a person's society chooses option A, then they will create and perpetuate suffering for themselves and everyone else. This is inevitable because they believe that suffering is acceptable. Note, when they do suffer, they have no right to complain, because it's absolutely ridiculous to complain about suffering if you believe that suffering is acceptable. Basically, if a person chose option A It would be like a person punching themselves in their face with their own fist and then complain that it hurts and that they're suffering. But they'll just keep doing this over and over again, despite the fact that they're suffering. They will tell other people to do the same thing. Of course, the only way that this can all permanently stop is when they change to option B and choose to believe that suffering is unacceptable. This is obvious because whilst they believe that suffering is unacceptable, it's just impossible for them to break the cycle of suffering. Pardon me as I take a sip. I.e., these people are literally creating their own suffering. Question: why do people choose option A? Answer: the reason why people choose option A is because they want to believe and need to believe and have to believe that suffering is acceptable because they can't believe that suffering is unacceptable and then have babies because everyone knows that babies will suffer regularly throughout their entire lifetime, i.e., they know that the baby will suffer regularly throughout its entire lifetime. And if they believe that suffering is unacceptable and then have a baby, then that would make them indisputably immoral, cruel, because they are causing suffering to a person for an entire lifetime. I am so glad I got lucky and did not have children. I can't imagine just looking at them every day and knowing that my decision brought them here against their will. That would just be brutal. I couldn't look at them. I couldn't do it. And they also know that if they believe that suffering is unacceptable, and they then use enslaved people as their personal slaves and or work slaves, then they are also indisputably immoral, cruel, because everyone knows that all personal slaves and work slaves suffer regularly throughout their entire lifetime. And another reason why people choose to believe that suffering is acceptable is because the only other alternative is to believe that suffering is unacceptable. And as soon as you truly believe and naturally live this, then everything in your life will start to shatter in ever deeper ways, as you realize that you have been brainwashed, programmed, used, enslaved in ever deeper ways. It's brutal, guys. This realization is brutal, especially if it happens to you all at once. It's a little bit easier if it happens kind of over time, but all at once, this is a brutal, brutal realization. But it's absolutely necessary to come to this realization. No matter how painful it is, you have to come to this realization. And you also realize that you have been brainwashed, programmed, using enslaving people, and therefore you have to accept and admit that you have been a selfish, immoral, cruel person, and perhaps even an evil person if you caused any people long-term suffering. And then you also realize that life and existence is prison, torture, slavery, rape, and that life and existence is cruel, evil. And therefore, this means that life and existence is survival of the stupidest. And the problem is that all of these realizations are inescapable because it applies to all aspects of life and all levels of life existence. And therefore, for most people, the implications become too much to bear, and therefore, they prefer to stay in delusion. Boom. And the only way to do this is to believe that suffering is acceptable. And like I said earlier, you have to push through the pain. You have to push through the pain of honesty, the pain of truth, so that you get out of your delusions and illusions. Side note, they might argue that suffering is necessary and or that suffering is important and or that life is perfect or whatever else. But this is all just another way of trying to brainwash program themselves and others to believe that suffering is acceptable. I'll explain this and all other such brainwashing, programming, lies, gaslighting in detail in the long conclusion. Note, it's important to see that this lie delusion is not just something that causes them suffering, because this lie delusion and that suffering is acceptable only gains weight, becomes real enough, if they're able to make other people believe it. This is why everyone is constantly trying to brainwash program everyone with it, directly and indirectly. And to make this belief have practical weight, they then have to brainwash program themselves and others to believe that it's acceptable to have personal slaves and or work slaves and babies. So, the key thing to see is that just because they don't want to face the truth of how things really are in life existence, they're willing to cause other people suffering just so that it makes them feel better. Boom. And in the case of believing that it's okay for them and or other people to have babies, they're causing immense amounts of suffering because every baby that is born will suffer regularly throughout its entire lifetime and cause suffering to other beings too. Like I said, this isn't even mentioning yet that we have to kill plants, insects, and animals just to survive, keep our own bodies alive. I.e., so much suffering is caused to everyone. It all keeps happening. And again, plants, insects, and animals. No organism on this earth consents to being captured, killed, force bred, raped. None of that. I.e., so much suffering is caused to everyone. It all keeps happening in endless cycles because people want to make themselves feel a bit better by deluding themselves enough to avoid having to face the truth of how things really are in life existence. And guys, if you ever have certain conversations, like I've had sort of a lightish conversation about this with my brother, and you can just see them run away from the conversation. You can see them run away. You can see the excuses and the delusions pop up, and just asking basic questions. Try this. And the key words is that the last sentence are a bit, because even after doing all of this, causing a lifetime of suffering to others, they still end up suffering the most at the time. Therefore, these people's societies are the definition of stupid, and they are indisputably selfish, immoral, cruel, evil. And it must be seen that these 4 words, selfish, immoral, cruel, evil, can't ever begin to describe the fact that these type A people societies are causing billions of people a lifetime of suffering, generation after generation. And what is also important to see is that these people have to brainwash program themselves and others to believe that it's acceptable for people to have babies, because if they start to believe that it's not acceptable to have a baby because having a baby is selfish, immoral, cruel, evil, because life is prison, torture, rape, slavery, then they would also have to accept that life is prison, torture, slavery, rape. And, of course, if a person accepts that life is prison, torture, slavery, rape, then they also have to accept that life is survival of the stupidest. So I'm going to end it here. Catch you guys in the next one.